Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not quite how you might expect from our title. I am Megan Cox.
And I am Clayton Becker.
And today, Clayton, what are we going to be talking about?
Today, we're going to be talking about rejecting impunity and embracing consequences.
Impunity, $10 word right there.
Yes, a big SAT word right there. Consequences, maybe a little more understandable. We should maybe mention up at the top that we do have a news hook for this one. Signalgate, Signal Ghazi, Whiskey Leaks, I heard someone call it, with reference with reference to Pete Hegseth. But yeah, I mean, we sure do fucking hate being right all the time.
Yeah. And again, when I started doing the research for this episode, ladies and gentlemen, there was not a news hook. It was just me complaining about stuff.
Yup, we plan these episodes completely without regard to current events, or at least we try to, right?
And it just keeps happening.
And we just keep being right. So yeah, it's like, you know, good for us that we are on top of these things, right? We're smart enough to see them coming.
Yes.
But not great for us and for the country in general, just more broadly speaking.
Yeah. So there is a news hook. We're going to get to it shortly. I don't intend that it's going to dominate this episode, but as you all know, when Clayton and I get going, we really get going. So who's to say? But I think many of us would agree, just with the basic premise, that it seems like our society, both politically and culturally, is populated by more jerks than before, whatever that before might be in each of our own kind of conceptions. And I think this is a statement that many people across the spectrum of society would probably agree with. What's your take on that, Clayton?
Yeah, I mean, like, for me, it's like the big dividing line really does seem to be COVID. Like, there are a lot of people who, like, now, like, COVID just drove a lot of people just insane, and they haven't quite gotten all of their marbles back into the jar or whatever. But I mean, you can sort of have you've seen this happening for a while, right?
Oh yeah.
Like my like political socialization, as it were, like when I became politically aware was like right after 2008, basically. I was like 11, 12, 13-ish, right? So like my very first like experience of politics as politics, rather than like, oh, there's an election happening, my parents care about it, is like the Tea Party. Right. Mm-hmm. So like, I don't remember a time period really where it felt like politics was more like stately and there was less like insulting nonsense going on and fewer presidents burned in effigies by protest movements and all of that. But it feels like even since then, politics have gotten a little bit crazier and like there's more jerks and there's less, as we talked about at the top, like any sort of real accountability for people's actions, as we're seeing with this like scandal happening right now in the Trump administration.
Absolutely. And it does trickle back out into society in events that seem political, but are not strictly political. I'm going to walk you through a bunch of different, I think, stages in this over the last decade and a half. But I do want to say, just backing myself up here, you can find any number of studies, including some that predate the COVID-19 pandemic that started in earnest in 2020, indicating a decrease in compassion and empathy. Sarah Conrath, who holds a PhD in social psychology and is a professor of philanthropy studies at Indiana University. Okay. I know, super interesting. Found that even before 2009, using the most common self-reported questions on empathy, young people were reporting that they had less empathy than previous cohorts. So this is a trend that's been building.
And we have that one, like, Trump guy, like, I don't know if he's a supporter or someone in the administration or whatever, some connected to Trump in the orbit of, like, don't commit the sin of empathy.
The book is called The Sin of Empathy. This guy is a pastor. It's in a Christian press.
Fucking insane, man. Absolutely fucking insane.
I know. This is even more fodder for our Reject Christianity, Embrace Christianity episode that we will have to do at some point. But yes, I looked that up, and now, of course, my recommendations are all screwed up.
Awful.
I wasn't going to go so far as to read it, but I really wanted to understand what it is beyond the title, just
right.
On that specific point. And it's really more, don't be empathetic to others if it causes you to reject other Christian doctrine. Mm-hmm. Really, like, don't be empathetic towards gay people, basically. It's where he's kind of going with that.
Many such cases. Yes, sorry, I've derailed you a little bit. It took less than 5 minutes. Yeah.
But so we've got that report on empathy. Psychologists at UC Berkeley also conducted a longitudinal study of 7,000 respondents of all ages. So from 18 to 100. Beginning in 2014 with follow-ups in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So you are getting across the pandemic. And you see that people's responses on the big 5 personality traits shifted more over the pandemic than you would ordinarily expect them to shift as people age, because your personality traits do change. But to the point that you and others are making, that it was the pandemic that broke people's brains, it did have a noticeable effect on people's personalities. Researchers found significant declines in extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness.
So all of the good ones.
All the good ones. Dang it. Compared with before the pandemic, and the drops were the strongest in young people. So, okay, we've got a society where people are being less considerate and less thoughtful of others. And ordinarily, society would correct for that through like social censure. You behave inappropriately and people around you assess you some sort of like social consequence. So you're kind of a jerk. I don't want to get lunch with you anymore, kind of thing. And that leads you to change your behavior in the future. And I think it's the consequence assessment component of this feedback loop that has broken down in our society. And it's broken down at the highest levels of society. And that also kind of causes it to deteriorate at just the level of interpersonal interaction or interaction in your community.
There are like social psychologists and like political psychologists who have looked at sort of like Donald Trump in particular creating like a permission structure essentially for people to act like assholes, for lack of better terms.
Yeah.
Where like the president acts in a certain way, and it's like, well, if the president is acting this way, then it must be acceptable. And as you mentioned there, like the consequence assessment part of the loop, where like you assess why people have stopped hanging out with you and going to lunch with you and all of that breaking down. Well, it's not because I was acting inappropriately, because after all, the president's doing that. All these people I like and respect are doing that. So it can't have been that I was acting inappropriately. It must be that the consequences themselves are unjust. And so I don't need to change my behavior.
Yeah. And you see someone like, do you remember Joe Wilson, who was, I believe, congressman from South Carolina, yelling "You lie" at President Obama during his State of the Union? And it is now, by the end of the Biden administration, it became normal for President Biden to get heckled during the State of the Union, to the point where it appeared he had rehearsed what he was going to say in response to heckling. I
can't remember which one it was, but one of the years he was like practically negotiating Social Security stuff, right?
Yes, he had planned for this. And this is not in the American tradition at all. We do not have a Westminster system where you're doing prime minister's questions. This was mind-blowing when Joe Wilson did it the first time, and now it's normal. So when you talk about permission structures, and then that Joe Wilson faced no consequences, he's still, I believe, in Congress. And it's been 15 years or something. So that there are no consequences assessed by the voters or really by anybody, it seems. And you just kind of keep doing it, and then it increases because people aren't seeing consequences being assessed to the instigator. You get people continuing to do it because they don't see a problem with it.
And I think a big part of this is like the normalization of this behavior through like different information channels as well. Like, I can't remember who exactly wrote this. I can't remember if it was a book or an article or whatever, but someone was writing an article about the Republican behavior during the Obama years. And it's basically like what the Republicans realized is that they could kick a dog on the floor of the Senate every morning. And for the first week, papers report it breathlessly. They're like, oh my God, Senate Republicans kick dog on the floor of the Senate. But then they just keep kicking the dog on the floor of the Senate, and eventually it becomes normal and non-newsworthy.
It's the normalization of deviance.
Yeah, it's the thing that Republicans do every morning, and so no one reports on it anymore. And so everyone's like, I mean, what are you going to do? The Republicans, they're going to kick a fucking dog on the floor of the Senate every morning, right? Meanwhile, everyone's sort of treating Democrats like the adults in the room, and then you censure Al Green when he stands up and heckles Trump.
Yes. So we will discuss the asymmetry. I want to put a pin in the asymmetry. But let's talk about Signalgate.
Let's talk about it.
Okay, so we have, just as the basics for, I can't believe that there are going to be people who listen to this podcast and aren't aware
If
of,
you are our one listener who manages to listen to this podcast, but also be living entirely under a rock
and just not
and
aware.
not
Or do we have, maybe we have conservative listeners who are, I don't know what the information stream is on this. But
Okay.
anyway, Signal Gate, quote unquote, several national security type folks in the Trump administration, to include Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard,
Vice President JD Vance.
Vice President JD Vance, active in the chat.
I don't know exactly what Mike Waltz's position is, but
I think he's the NSC director.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
National Security Council, I think.
So, yeah, a bunch of really high level national security and military officials in this chat. And then
on Signal, which is a platform that is used by people like journalists, dissidents, because messages can be set to delete at a certain time frame. So they are having a conversation on this platform, which is not secure. It is secure in transmission, but if a message is on your personal device, whatever that device may be, that device is not secure, and Signal is not keeping that safe on your device from collection by, say, a foreign power, hostile or otherwise. So they're having a conversation about airstrikes in Yemen that are gonna happen, and accidentally Michael Waltz, that NSC chair, I believe, has invited a reporter, an editor from The Atlantic.
Yes, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, is added into this channel, this Signal chat, with all of these high-ranking government officials, and they
says accidentally.
Yeah,
Goldberg says he's he gets an invitation and he doesn't know if it's real or not.
Yeah, and importantly, the members of this chat seemingly don't realize he is there. Or if they do see his number, if they do see him as a member of the chat, they are unconcerned about it. Because Pete Hegseth goes on to list very specific details of exactly when planes are taking off, when bombs will start to get dropped, so on and so forth. Really,
targets are
yes,
the name of a CIA official. Oh, the CIA director is also in this chat. Puts the name of a CIA official who is the deputy level contact for this whole operation, which has not been released by anyone at this point, because it is believed to be something that should probably not be public information.
And so, and despite that, though, despite the very specific details and despite this name not being released, the members of this chat and the Trump administration are claiming that nothing in the chat was classified, that it wasn't actually war plans. And Pam Bondi, the attorney general, earlier today came out and said, I don't think that there will be a criminal investigation related to this fiasco, basically.
This has Kash Patel, FBI director. They are not investigating it criminally.
Yeah, and in fact, the only investigation, so to speak, that has been proposed, I don't know if it has been even bandied about, even suggested, is that Mike Waltz will investigate it himself. So the dude who was responsible for putting Jeffrey Goldberg in the chat will investigate his own mistake.
Yes.
Which I saw someone talking about. This is the exact example of the guy in the hot dog costume saying, we're all trying to find the guy who did this.
As the Wienermobile has crashed into a building. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's obviously that guy, right?
The important context. But so all of this came to light because Jeffrey Goldberg, the reporter, editor at Atlantic, who was invited into the chat for reasons that no one seems to really have a good understanding of, including Michael Waltz, the guy who did it, he published this. After the attack, he waited until the attack had happened, which was what he says is the first time that he realized, oh, this was all real. All of these people were real. This is a real thing. He uninvited himself from the chat. And then he and peers reached out for comment to the different offices of the different people who were on the chat, where one of them confirmed that the chat was authentic. One of these offices confirmed that the chat was real. So you've got Hegseth, it seems, saying that the chat isn't real. Another office saying that the chat is real. Waltz on Laura Ingram's show, I think, was saying, that Goldberg snuck in somehow, and no real good theory of how that happened. And from my time doing lawyer things, let me tell you what, if you're proposing an alternate theory, you really got to have the details nailed down and they got to be plausible.
And on that point, like, importantly on that point, if he was able to sneak in, that would still be bad, right? Like,
Yes.
if he could sneak in, like, then someone who is indiscreet or actively malicious could sneak in, and you didn't
Which
notice.
is why
Yeah.
you don't do this on your personal phones on Signal. Again,
Yeah.
and as someone who has been a public employee, what I am thinking, the thought process that I am going through is, okay, so everything on your personal phone now is discoverable. Everything, again, the Steelman version of what is happening here is there was nothing that was classified. We were using Signal to get the messages to delete to avoid public records laws. That's the good version. Not unlike Pete Hegseth's marital indiscretions, where his version of no, I didn't rape her, I just had a consensual sexual encounter with a woman while I was married to somebody else and so drunk I barely remember it. That's not good either.
Yeah, this is a specific part of Project 2025, which calls for using these kinds of commercial platforms to avoid Freedom of Information Act requests. Like, that is why they were on Signal. That's why they were there in the first place, is so that if eventually something like this did happen or something went awry, none of these communications would be maintained as they are required to be maintained by federal law.
Even if you figured out that you had to go looking for personal phones, the messages would be gone and there would be nothing to discover.
And so this is like at every level here of this particular controversy, which we were not going to talk about. We were going to talk about something entirely different. Megan had a whole narrative about Wayne Gretzky planned, which we will not go into, unfortunately. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, like everything about it cries out, screams out for there to be some sort of consequences. And yet it seems like there's going to be, at this point, practically nothing.
I was chortling as I read all of the different updates on the story. And it wasn't until you and I were texting about it and in the run up to recording this show, I'm like, yeah, I just don't expect anybody to resign or be fired.
When in like any other political era, even in the first Trump administration, all of these people would be gone.
Yeah, you remember Tom Price?
Yeah, you remember, what was his name? A guy who was like linked to Turkey, right? General who was like the DNR.
Michael Flynn?
Yeah, Mike Flynn. Yeah, like he was gone in like 3 months, 4 months after starting his job in the Trump administration. Yeah.
Like, there is so very much that is just, in the first Trump administration, you would face some consequences, but we're sitting here really not expecting anything to happen, even though Pam Bondi and Kash Patel have decided they're not going to criminally investigate this. Fine, whatever. There is a universe of consequences between criminal and nothing that could be happening, including losing one's job, and it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. But I submit to you, just like we were talking about with Tom Price and Mike Flynn, it's new that there is this complete absence of consequences, and I want to talk about kind of different social stages that we took to get here.
Sounds
good. Let's talk about that. So I kind of want to start us with deplatforming people on the right wing on social media, which seems like a silly place to start, honestly. But I do submit to you that the panic around cancel culture of people, saying one off-color thing. Well, it usually wasn't one thing, but people say a thing and all of a sudden they are socially unacceptable. We can't have them speak at our university, or students will try to protest them at our university. I think Milo Yiannopoulos was kind of the king of this. I'll go to a place, I'll get shouted down, and that's the story, is how I'm not allowed to speak. I'm not being allowed to let my voice be heard, and people can't make their own judgments about what it is that I am going to say. This is also, you get kind of the coddling of the American mind, and so many
Jonathan
think
Haidt.
pieces. Yes, so many think pieces about people needing to be in their safe spaces, and words are violence, and all of it really is a sort of disinclination towards consequences for an idea that you are freely articulating. As an adult, Milo Yiannopoulos is an adult. And he is choosing to go to places, usually deliberately hostile places, to make a spectacle of making his argument. People are also allowed to disagree with it. Facebook, Twitter, any sort of social media platform, that's a business that can have terms of service. And the algorithm, which, is still a black box in so many ways. The same thing is true with TikTok or Instagram now. These private companies don't have an obligation to give you space to speak using their platforms. Just like PayPal doesn't have an obligation to let you fundraise. GoFundMe, same thing. They don't have an obligation to let you use their platform if you're violating their terms of service. So a lot of these arguments rely on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the First Amendment actually protects. Even in terms of content neutrality, it's only protecting your ability to not have a law that does not
that the state
discriminate against you on the basis of the content of your speech.
Yeah, and I think another piece of this, aside from sort of like a misunderstanding of what the First Amendment protects, is also just the way that the internet, like at least at the beginning, like amplified consequences for like ordinary people, like not the like professional provocateurs of the world, but like a situation where people would demand like really strident consequences for someone who did something that in the grand scheme of things is like a fairly minor transgression, right? And like we recognize, like it is legible as wrong, legible as sort of untoward and all of that. But now instead of like the circle of people in your town or the circle of people in your job or your friend group seeing that wrong behavior and being like, we are going to be the ones to inflict some sort of like socially appropriate consequences here. Instead, it's 600,000 people on the internet demanding that you be fired, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think like, even if that behavior was legible as wrong, in many cases it was totally legible as wrong. And as we've talked about in the past, it's often like when someone notices you doing the wrong thing, it wasn't that one instance, right, where you were doing the wrong thing. But even despite all of that, there's a degree to which like the consequences for ordinary people being like overused or overbroad, for lack of better terms, just can't think of any off the top of my head, led lots of ordinary people to believe that no consequences for any incorrect behavior was ever justified. And when they see people at the sort of top of these hierarchies not experiencing consequences for the same behavior, especially in the last, 5 to 10 years, that becomes much more like, well, I shouldn't have experienced consequences for this back when I did experience consequences. These other people shouldn't have experienced consequences. And so, like, there should never be any consequences ever. And that doesn't really work when you have people who do actually need to face some sort of accountability for their actions.
Yeah. And we've talked about kind of the enshittification of society. And I am going to pitch here that we do need more consequences at every level of society, but it's very hard to enforce consequences at lower levels of society when upper levels of society are not experiencing them. But you use the word hierarchy, and I am definitely going to take us to a place where hierarchy is very, very important. The next thing I want to talk about, though, and sort of our progression against consequences, is the election of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Donald Trump, famously, Teflon Don, the man does not face consequences for things. Just the one that I'm going to pull out is the way he spoke about women in very famous Access Hollywood audio recording in which he claimed that he would engage in inappropriate sexual behavior with them against their will or without their consent, the famous grab them by the pussy line. So Donald Trump gets elected.
Like 3 weeks after this tape is released, like immediately after, basically.
So, in and of itself, a little bit wild. I did hear, and props to Karen Pence, because it sure seemed from reports of kind of the backstage at the Trump victory rally in 2016 that she was the only one looking around at everybody going, I hope you're happy. But she was giving her husband a hard time, and I appreciate that about her. But Trump gets elected. And there's kind of a social debate over whether or not it is appropriate to impose social sanctions on people in the Trump administration, first of all, but also your friends who voted for Trump. Is a person obligated to remain friends with someone who was a friend of theirs who voted for Trump? And that is just such a weird question to ask as we kind of look back on it. Like, that was our primary concern in 2016 was, do we have to stay friends with people who it turned out were okay with the worst of Trump's behavior for the benefit of their, I don't know, 401k? That was a weird question.
Especially looking back to like where we are now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems a little bit wilder, but we were trying to figure out as a society, is it, the children who are wrong? Like, who is incorrect? Is it the people who are voting for Trump or the people who were icing them out because they voted for Trump or what have you? You ask, can a comedian make fun of Sarah Huckabee Sanders' makeup at an event where comedians are traditionally mocking politicians?
Yeah.
It was the White House Correspondents' Dinner. That's the whole thing. Can bystanders interrupt Sarah Huckabee Sanders' meal when she's dining out? Can actors make explicitly political statements to the vice president when he attends their performance? Is it appropriate or is it not appropriate? And my pitch to you on this is the intersectionality of that moment where you're kind of seeing a debate over whether or not the hierarchy in American life is really changing.
Mm-hmm.
Can women criticize men? Or can women hold men accountable for their behavior? This is also the era of Me Too.
Mm-hmm.
Racial and ethnic minorities challenge white people and say, you said something racist and I have this video of you doing it. And so I do think you should lose your job as a public figure or what have you. And to your point, you do get some non-public figures who get caught in that dragnet. Do you have a right to eliminate from your social circle conservative people who are, I will say, traditionally also at the top of that hierarchy? Can children cut off their parents? All of these sorts of...
And it seems like only people who, like, as you said, ordinary people being caught in the dragnet, very few of the people who are actually in the, like, quote unquote superior position in that hierarchy, in those hierarchical relationships, did actually face significant, substantial consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least long-term significant, substantial consequences.
Yeah, who has successfully been canceled?
Very few people, right? And only the people who, like, when we looked into it more, were actually doing like really heinous illegal shit, right? Like people who ended up going to prison because of their behavior, not like who ended up losing job opportunities, right? Like
that's kind of the level that you wind up on. The tactics to push back evolve. I think the Johnny Depp Amber Heard of it all is an example of that. We start saying, well, he wasn't the only victim, so it's okay. So I think that the argument against consequences tends to only go one way. People shouldn't be punished for voting conservative, but conservatives can accuse people of criminal sexual misconduct, and that's fine.
Yeah, like Democrats can't, like, if a Democrat like pointed to the Appalachian region and was like, look at these like shithole areas, like they'd lose.
They cling to their guns and religion.
Yeah, like they would be
pilloried. Controversy.
Yeah, like they're pilloried for it, right?
Yeah.
But like if Republicans are allowed to call inner cities shitholes all the time, and basically nobody bats an eye.
Absolutely. Well, and this is, so there's a quote from Taylor Swift, preeminent philosopher of our age,
mm-hmm.
where she's giving an interview, and it's a very long quote, so I'm not going to read it. But in substance, what she says is, I pushed back against a person who was kind of making out like I was crazy. She's describing this creative process behind the song Mad Woman. She is pushing back, and the pushback is treated as the offense. And when we think about the discourse around cancel culture, is that not exactly where we are? We're not talking about why people were being canceled. We're talking about whether or not it is appropriate to cancel people. So
we're not talking about whether or not the behavior was wrong. we all recognize the behavior was wrong, but then we're saying, should they actually have to face any consequences for it? And when the consequences don't seem to fit the crime, we then say, well, actually, maybe the behavior wasn't wrong in the first place.
So I think this moves out of the realm of speech and into the realm of behavior during COVID, because the COVID restrictions that we get are behavioral ones. People are told that they need to remove their children from school, remote school their children. They can't have in-person gatherings. They have to wear masks and they have to get vaccinated. And there are groups of people that object to each of these different things. Those groups often overlap, but not necessarily. And once a person has decided that they will not be doing the prevention measure, they will not be changing their behavior, then they object to the consequences for the prevention measure. It is unjust for me to lose my job because I won't get vaccinated, etc. So it's kind of a different take on the COVID broke everybody's brains idea. And there is a physiological basis for the idea that stress makes people less cognitively able. But we saw other people getting away with violating rules or norms, so it becomes harder to convince ourselves that we need to follow rules or norms, especially when it comes to cost to us. It's very hard to tell yourself, I can't go to my grandmother's funeral when other people are having parties.
Yeah, and like there was definitely a degree of like politicians not following their own rules in this respect, right? Like Nancy Pelosi getting her hair done, Gavin Newsom doing a dinner at the French Laundry, to the point where, and I think that this is something I've talked about, which is not like directly related, but I think is tangentially related, which is that over the last decade or so, we've really seen like a failure of the idea that people have like positive pro-social obligations to each other. And I think this is like, they're related to one another. The idea that like there should be consequences for antisocial behavior is directly related to the idea that there are like no actual positive pro-social obligations that we have to one another.
You don't have to do things for anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Up to and including just managing your own business, which you would think would be a conservative value to say, like, I'm going to take care of myself and my stuff. And it just doesn't seem that anybody really feels that way. Something that I've noticed is there's kind of a flip in what the word consideration means, or how people kind of describe the positive trait of being considerate. It is usually not directed at oneself. It is directed at others. And the idea that others should anticipate what your needs are going to be.
Yeah.
Or what all the possible needs of a person could be, and should behave in such a way, and not an idea that, oh, I should be thinking about what is going to be the best for others around me, and that's how I should be conducting myself. This is the dumbest possible example, but communal laundry is always a point of conflict in apartment living. And there is probably every few months a debate on the group chat of my apartment complex about, is it reasonable to take people's laundry out of the laundry machine before they, can you take people's stuff out of the dryer if you're waiting on them to come and do it? And it's always some like, well, I try to get there on time, but I shouldn't have to, you shouldn't touch my stuff. It's like, no, set an alarm on your phone.
Yeah.
Like, make sure that you're not in other people's way so that other people can get their stuff done. It's wild that the idea of consideration has become something that other people owe you, not that you owe other people.
Yeah, not that like I should have to consider what other people are going through and what they might need at the moment, but that everybody should have to consider what I need in this moment. Like
absolutely.
It's this very sort of selfish, self-centered idea that like everyone's the protagonist of their own narrative, right? But like the idea,
the worst possible main character syndrome.
Yeah, but it's like, everyone's like, oh, well, like all of these people who are like causing traffic for me, right? Like they're not being considerate of what I need right now, right? Anyway, like we don't need to get too in depth of it. We already gave the laundry example, but yes, I think this is absolutely true. The idea of consideration has done a 180 from this idea that like you should be considering the needs of others around you to everyone else should be considering my needs.
I think that's very true. And you do see this filter even more into our politics now, where it seems that elected officials are completely rejecting the idea that they should be open to criticism for their actions or positions, which is fascinating. And so we've already kind of talked about the young employees of the Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, that was with sarcastic finger quotes for those of you who are not watching us on YouTube. So you've got the Doge employees who are kind of pushing back against the idea that their identities should be public.
Yeah, like they're not like deep cover CIA agents, right? Like
No, no,
they're
no, no.
yeah, and like you need to know who these people are in order to have any sort of hope of holding them accountable for their behavior, for their
100%,
actions.
100%. Also, so this happened in the only Republican representative from Oregon. His name is Cliff Bentz. I actually knew him personally when he worked at the state legislature, and he seemed like a very reasonable guy. He had a town hall, got yelled at, as you do. Honestly, selection bias should tell you that you're going to get yelled at a town hall if you have a town hall. But
Yeah.
by God,
No one has ever gone to a town hall to tell their representative, "You're doing a great job.
thanks, bro.
Keep
I
up the
have no
good work."
notes.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah. Someone was telling me earlier, like, no one has ever like gone through all of the like steps of like calling your cable company, right, to tell them their service is great, right, and that there's no
Yeah,
problems.
100%,
Yeah.
100%. So these, and this, many such cases, many representatives are going to the point where they're not having them anymore. They're going to town halls and they're getting yelled at. And the response is telling their constituents, I don't have to be here. I can just leave. No, your job is literally to hear what they have to say and either translate it into action or come up with a very good rationale why what they want can't happen.
Yeah, I think that this pervades all levels of government at this point right now. Like
Absolutely.
I went to a Beverly Hills City Council meeting last week before. Basically, very, very long story short, they pressured the landlord of an abortion provider to rescind the abortion clinic's lease. The abortion clinic was like, "We're going to sue you because of that." And then Beverly Hills filed an anti-SLAPP motion, which is like an anti-frivolous lawsuit motion. The Attorney General of California was like, "Yeah, Beverly Hills broke the law," but a judge granted the anti-SLAPP motion. And so Beverly Hills was like pursuing attorney's fees. Anyway, very long story condensed into 45 seconds there. But I was there at the city council meeting to basically be like, "Hey, Beverly Hills, knock it off. Like, take the legal victory, settle like amicably with this group that you forced out of your city." And like the members of the Beverly Hills City Council were like irate that we had shown up. There were like a few dozen of us that like they were like that we had the temerity to show up and call them out on their behavior. They were like shaking their head. They were like laughing to each other up on the dais. Like they were like, "How dare we have to listen to these people like coming and giving public comment about how they disagreed with our decision?" And it's like, no, you're an elected official. You're going to sit up there and take it because that's your
You're
fucking
probably
job.
not going to lose re-election, but you at least have to hear that we think you're wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Oh.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I have one more point and then we'll go to a break because we've been talking for a while. But I think at the same time, we do see a distortion of the concept of the Karen. And I promise this is related. I know it sounds like it's going to be completely ridiculous, but we keep talking about how there's no enforcement of social consequences. At the same time, we have villainized the character who is responsible for enforcing social consequences in many cases. So Karen, as it was initially conceived, was a white woman, and I say this as a white woman who attempted to enforce social norms, air quotes, which were often imaginary or inconsistent, and she was trying to enforce them on people of color. Examples include calling the police because she doesn't think that residents using a communal space were actually residents of her community, shutting down children's lemonade stands, criticizing people for speaking languages other than English in public, that sort of thing. That's all kind of bullshit. We can kind of agree, like it's a little bit nonsense that the woman is doing that and intervening,
Yes, absolutely.
So that's bullshit. That's where it started. Where it has landed is not bullshit. We now understand any woman attempting to enforce rules or norms, however justified on any person ever, as a Karen, including I saw a video of a woman walking on a trail where dogs must be leashed, telling some people with an unleashed dog that they needed to leash their dog. And of course, everyone has a camera phone. So everybody pulls out their phone and starts recording this conversation. And this woman is just like, I mean, maybe you don't like her tone. Maybe you think she's too strident, but she's saying, hey, this is a leashed area. You need to put a leash on your dog. There are reasons for that. What I have a problem with people who just let their dogs run around unleashed just generally, as a person with a super reactive dog. But the stereotype coupled with the ubiquity of cameras on phones creates a chilling effect, even though the pendulum's kind of swinging back in the other direction. So why is this all bad, I suppose, rather than just a change that we should think about, but not like do an entire 45-minute diatribe about it? The lack of accountability for others decreases incentives for us to follow rules ourselves. And rules and norms increase predictability. Absence of predictability increases decision fatigue and stress, which we know compounds poor decision making and emotional dysregulation. But in our politics, that's where we start to see, a sense of, and we haven't even really talked about polarization or the asymmetry of this all of that much, but when you stop being willing to enforce consequences on members of your own circle, then actual bad things might happen, such as the compromising of the US intelligence community by a hostile foreign power. Maybe it's a dog off a leash, maybe it's an intelligence failure. Who's to say?
They are different levels of scale, certainly, but the basic idea behind the premise that there should be some social norms that people adhere to, I think is not completely insane. So when we come back, we'll talk maybe about how we do that a little bit more, how we get people to embrace these sort of social norms, how we get people to actually face any sort of consequences commensurate with their behavior in order to forestall the largest scale fuck-ups that happen when there are no consequences for people who really need them. All right. Hello, everyone. Once again, welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When we left off, Megan and I were telling you all of the terrible things that have happened over the last several years and how everything sucks and it's really bad and it's a big, big tragedy. So Megan, maybe in the next half of the episode here, you can help us understand a little bit of how we can resolve these problems.
Yes, only I can fix it. So
only
here we
Megan
go.
can fix it. How can we bring back consequences in a way that result in better consequences for other people rather than the consequences that are not being faced by the current transgressors amongst us?
Yes. So I think I don't have a plan to hold Pete Hegseth accountable for posting whatever he posted in a Signal chat. I don't have a plan for that. My plan is much more bottom up, restoring consequences for lower level societal transgressions and kind of reintroducing to ourselves, holding ourselves to the standard that maybe we wish our elected officials were being held, which in a way can re-normalize holding them accountable, I would hope. I do want to quickly mention, I sort of breezed over it, polarization is probably one of the bigger issues when it comes to holding politicians accountable. If you know that the alternative to holding a politician accountable is somebody who's of the other party from you or from that politician gains some power, you probably don't want to do it. But we do know that co-partisans are the only ones who can effectively hold elected officials accountable. This is something that we know from the Nixon resignation and Watergate, the original gate, Watergate. We know that things really turned when Republicans began to attempt to hold the president accountable. It became clear that the president no longer had the support of his own party, and that was the thing that really pushed him out of office.
That's the really key distinction between Nixon resigning over Watergate and Trump not resigning over any of his myriad scandals that are, quite frankly, as bad or even worse than Watergate, right? Is that every single time there was a Watergate level scandal in the Trump administration, the Republican Party was like, nope, we are going to stand by this guy. It's why he didn't resign over withholding aid to Ukraine. It's why he didn't resign over January 6th.
It's why he ran again and won.
Yeah, it's why he won't face any consequences over his senior most advisors, totally beefing a very important, in their view at least, because we can all agree that bombing Yemen is bad and should not be done. They totally beefed a high stakes military operation. And if Jeffrey Goldberg were not even malicious, but just merely indiscreet, it could have resulted in the deaths of American service members.
Yep.
So what do we do, Megan?
What do we do? What do we do? I would say that we should enforce norms and kind of lower level rules and enlist others or institutions to enforce them for us. So I could open this up very broadly, Clayton, and just ask you what annoys you in society. But because we've already spent 45 minutes on the front half of this episode, I think I probably should just assume there are some things.
There are some things
that annoy you. Clayton and I were joking that we needed the administration to stop doing things and saying things, or this episode would be 6 hours long.
we're well on our way there. Yeah.
Two-parter. So there are any number of things that probably annoy you in terms of functioning in everyday society. And much of it, I bet, is other people not following norms. You know, somebody cuts you in line at the grocery store or something, and it just riles you up. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, riles you up. And how do we address that interpersonally to hopefully help everyone feel more comfortable and more inclined to follow norms and rules? Because I think it'll then compound. If you know others around you are going to do it, I think you are more inclined to do it as well. You kind of lose the whole idea of following the rules being a sucker's game.
Yeah. We have to like change the frame from being, why am I facing consequences when all of these like higher ups are getting away with things, to why are they getting away with things when I'm down here facing consequences?
Yes, exactly. Despite the fact that a therapist might tell you to focus on your circle of control, I want you to pull those elected officials back inside your circle of control here. But I saw this story. It was actually in the New York Post, which will probably be the first and only time that this podcast approvingly cites to the New York Post. But a Brazilian woman is suing the airline she flew on, as well as the woman who filmed her and posted a video of her without her consent. This woman was asked by another woman who was flying with her child to switch seats so that the woman and the child could fly together. And I think so she could have the window.
Which woman is doing the filming and the suing in this scenario?
Completely a third person filmed it. So seated passenger, mom, third person with a camera. She is suing the third person with the camera who filmed and posted it and the airline because she was asked, can you switch seats so that my child and I can sit together and my child can have the window seat that you're sitting in? And the seated woman said, no, I paid for my seat. This is where I want to sit and I'm going to stay here. And the mother continued to verbally harass her, which is all video recorded, after the passenger said no. And the airline didn't intervene in any of this. And so the woman who declined to switch seats, she says the harassment and filming, as well as the airline's failure to prevent it or to resolve the issue, have led her to suffer emotional distress and financial consequences because it was posted online and she was embarrassed and blah, blah, blah. And this is a classic debate of like, are you obligated to switch seats so that a parent and a child can sit together? And there are as many opinions on this as there are people, but I think we can all agree that really the problem to resolve is the airlines. The airline is the one that needs to fix it. And this woman was not obligated to switch seats, in my opinion, change a seat that she'd paid for. But now she's like this. The recording of me, the yelling at me, that's a problem for the airline. The airline needs to fix this. I completely agree. And I think the flight crew had an obligation to step in and resolve the issue. And the failure to do so is the cause of harm to the woman. I don't know. What's your take on this?
I think it seems reasonable. Like, I am the kind of person where I would give up my seat if I were flying alone. Like, because I just don't. It's fine, it's whatever. But like, if I really wasn't feeling it, like, yeah, I think it's the airline's responsibility, and the airline should be the one to like either enforce that social norm or whatever, and they should face consequences for failing to do so.
I also think, this is always kind of the response of like, well, why are the mother and child not seated together already? Was there an opportunity to select seats and they didn't? If they didn't, they shouldn't assume that somebody else is going to come in and fix their problem. But yeah, I think that's the fundamental thing is this is something we have these problems all the time. It seems like this comes up a lot, and maybe it's just engagement bait, but really it seems as though the airlines should be the ones managing this problem. If you have an underage child that is not seated with a parent or responsible guardian, then Shouldn't the airline be the one that's fixing this? And the fact that the woman is calling out the airline and saying, you should have fixed this, you should have prevented this, why is it on me to fix your problem and then to endure consequences that you should be facing when I don't want to fix it the way they want it fixed, sort of thing. So what else can we do? How can we exert kind of informal social control, I suppose? What else can we do to conform to expectations or consequences, I guess? I would say when we receive some sort of social pushback or censure, to listen to it and to maybe learn from it what your community's expectations are. I do have an example of that.
Yes, you've written in the notes Ian's party, how it changed our behavior. This means nothing to me.
Nothing to you. Ian is my downstairs neighbor, and he and I have known each other since we were very young children. The house that we live in is his mom's. It's been in their family for a long time. It's an inner city house. Where I live, I would describe it's a residential neighborhood, but we are in a city. A friend of Ian's says, "Hey, can we host a party at your house where we're going to have, it's kind of an open mic night thing. And we'll do it kind of in your garage/driveway." We're like, yeah, sure, fine, whatever. It got a little out of hand, as some of these things can do sometimes. More people came than we were expecting, sort of thing. And we had amplified sound. And so some of the neighbors were not super excited about that. We had kind of done a little like scuttling around, just like, hey, we're going to have a party. It was dark because it was like November, but it was 7 p.m. on a Saturday night. And our neighbors across the street got very upset, called Ian's mom because as the landlord, I don't know that they knew
that she was that
relationship, but they called the landlord to complain about the music. And it's 7 p.m. So we're well within the bounds of city noise ordinances. And we kind of, we'll be done by 10, which is when we would need to be done. And their other complaint was, well, it's not just that it's loud, it's that there's a lot of profanity and we have young children.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess the follow-up question, do you think we had another one of those parties?
Yeah, you guys had one the next day, right? Because you wanted to be...
No, we didn't. We have never done that again. Because despite the fact that our pushback was, we're in a city and we can have amplified music until 10 p.m., and how dare you, kind of thing. We're like, we got them across the street. We got a couple more houses down there with younger kids. Maybe this isn't what we want to be doing. And we've never done it again. And so that's just like and it hasn't even occurred to us to do it again, quite frankly. And that's just an example of modifying your behavior because of the expectations of others around you. We were censured. There aren't really consequences. Like, those people are kind of standoffish. It's not like we were going to hang out with them anyway, but it's not worth whatever other controversy there could be at that point to like.
But I think the salient point is that like you took that pushback as like a mild form of censure, a mild form of consequences, and you haven't repeated the behavior that resulted in it. You could very easily imagine another set of neighbors being like, "Fuck you, Karen." For those who are not watching
Sorry,
us
Mrs.
on YouTube,
Becker.
Yeah.
Sorry, Reverend Dr. Mrs. Becker.
Well, my mom kept her maiden name, actually, Megan. So,
okay, well then. Dang.
But anyway, you guys didn't hear this thing Megan and I were talking about in the break. My mom's name is Karen. This is why this is important. Yes, anyway. But you could very much imagine like another set of neighbors doubling down on the bad behavior and hosting more late night parties in a way that would eventually be either like negative consequences, like in terms of health to their children, because like their children wouldn't be able to sleep or whatever, or even more negative consequences because like they're leaving late at night, people drink at these parties, there's like dangerous driving happening, right? Like you can imagine this starting to spiral out of control if people, instead of taking the consequences and actually considering them, as we mentioned earlier, considering other people, the actual meaning of what it should mean to be considerate, right? Instead of doing that, instead of taking that, doubling down and making things worse, you could totally imagine that happening. And so I think that's like, if we're talking about this bottom up sort of strategy of like, yeah, actually, maybe we shouldn't do things that antagonize people.
Yes.
Like, to a certain extent, there's like a little bit of choosing your battles, right? Like if you guys were playing classical music at 3 p.m. on a Saturday and they were annoyed about that, then maybe you can be like, okay, like maybe let's be a little serious. But if it's like you guys are playing music that has a ton of profanity, it's like later in the evening at least, and they have young children, like use our brains here a little bit, people,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
Like let's use our
absolutely.
brains.
Absolutely. And yeah, we're just kind of like, we hadn't thought about it that way. And what was fun was all of the people, Ian's and my age, who were kind of there, just sort of milling about and we're discussing it. Everybody, when we kind of repeated it, like, oh yeah, huh, yeah, all right. And so we haven't done it again. And that's the easiest solution. It also doesn't cost us anything. We're not super put out about not having a party in our driveway. It's completely fine. And again, so Ian's got a band, they practice in the basement. No complaints about that. Because you can practice music in the middle of the day on a Wednesday and it's pretty fine. Nobody's that mad about it. So that's one kind of aspect of restoring consequences and accountability in our society, starting with yourself and actually thinking about the feedback that you're getting from others and whether or not it seems to pass the smell test for you and what can you do to be more considerate of others in the first place. Something else that I would suggest, which is going to sound a little bit controversial, is almost a version of broken windows policing, which is a very contentious concept, but we're going to talk about how you avoid the parts of broken windows policing that you don't like, which is the racism and the actual data issues with broken windows policing. But first of all, I do want to say not all norm or rule violations are created equal, and some cause injury or death. People tend to treat traffic violations as if they're kind of unimportant, and that's not true. Any better way to say it? That's just incorrect.
I mean, yeah, we talked about it recently in multiple of our like transportation and vehicle related episodes. There's like 40,000 traffic incident related deaths in the United States every single year and hundreds of thousands of injuries. Like these are not like minor problems, right?
No.
There are substantially more people killed in vehicle incidents than there are with guns. In the United States. And yet we often treat traffic violations as like, oh, they just ran the stop sign.
Yeah. We treat vehicles as deadly weapons only when we want to punish Black or brown people for gang related activity, it seems. You know, like that's the only time. Not white people for gang related activity either. There's a racial valence to it. But cars are deadly weapons, but we treat running speeding or running traffic lights as if these are not extremely dangerous behaviors that are repeated. So after the pandemic, traffic citations decreased while traffic fatalities increased, and this was in many ways caused by officers attempting to avoid spreading COVID through contact with members of the public. But the resulting trend is more reckless driving and less enforcement. That's problematic on its face, and it's an easy place to start when it comes to enforcing low-level rules and norms. But other low-level rules and norms could also stand to be more strongly enforced, kind of reversing the trend away from enforcement that really picked up in 2020 due to police reform initiatives. And this is kind of, I think, an unintended consequence, and I'm going to leverage my experience working in law enforcement at that time. One of the legal reasons why lower level laws stop being enforced, police reform lowers the permissible level. Many police reform initiatives lowered the permissible level of force. That meant that even enforcement action wouldn't really resolve the problem. An example of that was moving possession amounts of most drugs to a violation rather than a misdemeanor in Oregon, which is a legal change that has been reversed at this point. If you are trying to tell someone who is using a drug that is just a violation level drug out on the street, they only have possession level amounts, you want to give them a citation for that drug, which is basically what you're giving. It's like giving somebody a traffic ticket while they're standing there smoking fentanyl or whatever. You go up to them, you ask them for identification, they say, fuck you. Then what happens? It's kind of the end of the interaction. And you're at a point where there's no enforcement. Not even the ticket, just nothing's happening.
And I think an important piece of this is that, like, the severity of consequences doesn't seem to matter as much as the certainty of consequences. Like, you can deter a lot of, like, antisocial behavior, like running stop signs, like smoking fentanyl or crack in public, right? Which, like, if you want to do that in the safety of your own home, whatever. I'm not going to stop you, right? But you want to you want to do it out on the street again, like where there are kids or where there are other people. Like, come off it, man. Like, don't just fuck off a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, do I think that you should be imprisoned for it? No. Do I think you should be like brutalized for it? No. Do I think you should have to face some sort of like actual consequence for it? Yeah. Right? Like, the certainty of consequences is much more important than the severity of consequences. And so,
because it dictates your behavior going forward.
Yeah, like if you know every time you run a red light that you're gonna face a $500 fine, you're not gonna do it very often, right? Like, as compared to if you have the like a 1 in 10 chance that you're gonna face a $5,000 fine, that like averages out to the same amount of money, right? But people don't actually behave in like that rational expectation-y way, right? And so, maybe to bring it out of like drug enforcement a little bit, which I just don't know anything about, into like the sort of like traffic world,
stuff that you do
know. The stuff that I know about, more things that I know about. If like, I think another part of this is like, we don't. I think we talked about this maybe a little bit in one of the recent episodes where like traffic stops, like drug busts, whatever, like those are the places where like things go bad for police public interactions, like way more often than like any other type of interaction practically. And so as much as is possible, like making it so that those don't even need to have police public interactions in order for those consequences to be faced, right? Like if you run a stop sign, if you run a traffic light, there is a camera there, right? That like will tell you that like you broke the law. That seems to be a much better, like much more equitable as well way of like making sure these consequences happen for people.
The only traffic citation on my record is a photo ticket from running a red light into a right turn.
Yeah.
Where a right turn was legal, I just didn't stop before I did the turn, And
like one of the things that people talk about when they talk about traffic enforcement is that like it often is applied in a like it's like applied in a racially biased way, right? We know that this happens because of a number of different studies, but one study that I think is very clever is that the racial disparities disappear at night when the police can no longer see the race of the driver behind the car.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I think, a very clever way of getting at this. But like just having it be like, if you are in a car, if the car that is registered to you like runs the red light, you face the consequences, right? Like that would do a lot to make sure that we don't actually have people just like randomly like disregarding traffic laws all the time.
And it's noteworthy that people lose their minds about the idea of, traffic camera tickets and speed cameras. That tends to get really very strong pushback. And I think it is another one of those, the consequences shouldn't be guaranteed. It should be a dice game on the basis of whether or not there is a police officer there that day.
Yeah, and it's like, these don't even need to be particularly stringent consequences, right? Like, they don't need to be consequences that are going to, like, bankrupt you if you run a red light. It's like, just, if you know that every time you do it, you're going to face a $50 fine or whatever.
Have I ever rolled through a stoplight when turning right since that ticket? No, sir.
Yeah, right? Like, I don't know. Anyway, we're getting a little bit off the rails here, but the basic idea is, like, this idea of broken windows policing is, like, the original idea, the way it was implemented, was very bad, right?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about why that is and how to avoid it.
But the basic idea is that some sorts of consequences for bad behavior, for antisocial behavior, that I think hopefully if you've reached this point in the episode, you can agree with us, like, is causing broad social level problems. Like, that's something that we should get, that there should be consequences for antisocial behavior.
Yeah. So broken windows policing, I mean, you had a very strong negative reaction when I used the words broken windows policing initially, 10 minutes ago. It is bad policy. It's also questionable theory, but the bad policy arises out of the disparate impact and over-policing of minority communities. It is also seen to have a negative impact on police behavior because you are kind of turning up that one-way ratchet and telling police officers that it is even more important that they address these low-level infractions because they will lead to higher levels of crime. Not to say, well, just don't fucking do that. But if we know that over-policing of minority communities leads to disparate impacts, why are we still doing it? How about we try over-policing white communities for a change, where people are very resistant to consequences. Because this is a pretty white phenomenon, I gotta say.
And as we mentioned, like the hierarchy thing, right?
Yes,
like, yeah.
exactly. The hierarchy thing is part of the issue. So if you are adjusted to not facing consequences for your behavior, and all of a sudden there are consequences all over the place, that would, I think it's, we say we're not talking about this in a purely rational manner, but if all of a sudden you're starting to see consequences, at some point you're going to change your behavior. And I don't think it would take that long to do it.
Yeah.
And so, not to hand wave away the negative racial implications of the concept of broken windows policing, but just don't do that does seem to be a powerful mitigation.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little hand wavy to say just don't do that, because we know that police probably will continue to do it in certain respects, right? Like they don't seem to want to listen to a lot of these directives, right? Police in San Francisco, for example, just like stopped enforcing certain laws altogether. They like did basically a wildcat strike where they didn't announce they were doing a strike, but they just stopped enforcing all the various laws.
See, again, I think that goes back to a little bit of the issue of lowering the acceptable use of force for the community's standards. It's in the Graham factors. It's what tells you what level of force you can use to enforce something. If you've changed the community's perception of what level of force is possible, a reasonable police officer is going to change their enforcement practices. But that being said, I don't particularly know the case that you're speaking about.
For San Francisco, it's like they just literally stopped enforcing any type of traffic violations at all. Like
that's a problem.
Like in COVID, you can see it has like this very long downward trend of like how often they're enforcing these laws, and then during COVID it falls to nothing basically, and then just never goes back up. But anyway, like again, not to hand wave away the problems with this like concept of broken windows policing. We are absolutely not advocating for going back to that kind of disparate enforcement.
But if I were to say, hey, I just want to enforce a lot of low-level anti-antisocial regulations and ordinances and something, if I didn't call it broken windows policing, I think you'd probably be on board with it.
Yeah, and I think the important thing, like the really important thing before we sort of wrap up here, is that like we cannot have a society where antisocial behavior never faces any sort of consequences. It's just not possible, right? And I think the last part of that, before we wrap up here, is like changing sort of the nature of consequences from like inherently punitive, like inherently carceral, to like more community oriented.
Yeah, I mean, you can be corrective without being carceral.
Yeah, like the idea, the basic like distinction between, as Megan put it while we were doing the prep work for this episode, the difference between calling out and calling in, right? That's the same basic distinction that exists between corrective and carceral. Like, we don't want to like ruin people's lives and like, cause them to like have higher rates of like recidivism and all of this stuff by like doing consequences that are like fully disproportionate to the transgressive behavior, right? Like this is one of the big problems with mass incarceration, is that like mass incarceration is criminogenic in many ways. It actually increases criminal activity among the people who like get out of prison, right? It's bad. That's a bad thing, right?
If what we're looking for is less crime, it is indeed a bad thing.
Yes, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be any consequences whatsoever. Like, as we said, there's a difference between criminal prosecution and nothing for government officials.
Vast array of options. Getting fired, resigning.
There is also a distinction between incarceration and nothing for these sorts of low-level antisocial behaviors, right? And insofar as we cannot solve the problem of Pete Hegseth not being prosecuted for any of his transgressions over the past...
Or even fired, maybe.
Over the past decade. Much as we cannot solve this problem of, like, the current, like, clusterfuck in Washington, right? There is something that we can do to, like, hopefully forestall this rise in antisocial behavior among people and get back to a situation where, like, if you do things that negatively impact other people, you actually do have to face some sort of consequences for those actions, whether that's social sanction, whether that is monetary, or in the extreme cases, whether that does involve actual, like, criminal prosecution, right? Because we can all agree that there are some things you probably should be prosecuted for. Like, you engage in sexual assault and rape, like, you should go to jail for that. You should go to jail for that, right? Like, not to be a big bad
Yeah, this is not an abolitionist podcast.
Yeah, like, not to be a big bad, like, carceral urbanist or whatever, but I think rapists do deserve time in prison, right? Like, so anyway, like, to bring it back just to the basic idea of rejecting impunity and embracing consequences. We're not saying we need to embrace every single variant of consequence. We're not saying we should go back to an era of mass incarceration. We're not saying we should do the things that have, like, caused, like, more criminogenic behavior in the first place.
But we should be at a position where we can hold each other accountable through some mechanism. Because at the moment, we have none.
Yeah. And I think Megan and I would both prefer that in most instances that mechanism is social, right? Having, like, social networks and like social sanction can be quite important, right?
Informal social control is the alternative to formal policing consequences.
Yeah.
Which is what usually screws up the broken windows theory.
And I think that what we should think about here is, like, we do not want to live in a society where everyone is running red lights, everyone is running stop signs, no one picks up after their dogs, right? Like, we don't want to live in a society where people act however they want without regard for others in a way that makes everyone's lives worse, right? And as much as we would love it if everyone could just, like, act in a pro-social way and have this, like, pro-social battery inside of them that, like, tells them what to do and tells them right from wrong. As long as we would love Jiminy Cricket, right, in everyone's head.
Yeah.
Sometimes
the legal system, unfortunately, is Jiminy Cricket for some people. Yes. We have to change the incentives.
Yes. Sometimes people do actually need to face social or legal sanction for antisocial, illegal, dangerous behavior. And right now, people are not facing those consequences, or at least certain people aren't facing those consequences, and it is making everyone's lives a lot shittier. As has been a running theme on this podcast, the enshittification of American life. Part of it is that everyone is looking out for number one and nobody cares about anybody else. But until we manage to do that, which for not the first time on this podcast, but might be a long ways off, might be more difficult in this instance than in some of the other ones we've talked about, given there's no real policy we can point to here. Until we manage to do that, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.